Hello and welcome to episode 26 of Airs for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillett. In this episode, I'm speaking with Bruce Peter about his new book, Jet Age Hotels and the International Style 1950 to 1965, published by Lilly Publications in 2020.
So there's a very strong political and economic aspect to this subject, but of course, it's not the only aspect. There's as much as America was wanting to gain cultural and economic and political influence around the world, different countries around the world were wanting to be noticed in the new post-war setting. And I would say that one of the things that Annabelle Jane Wharton in her research, excellent as it is, ignores is the strong will on the part of other countries to assert themselves through the design of hotels.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture with me. I'm talking today to Bruce Peter. Bruce, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ambrose. I work at Glasgow School of Art in Scotland, and I'm half British and half Danish, and have a great interest in 19th and 20th century buildings and design, one could say largely for bourgeois consumption and for leisure and entertainment and for travel. And I've written a number of books on a range of subjects, old cinemas, a lot about ships, ocean liners and cruise ships and ferries and seagoing passenger travel and railways and even buses and various different things. But the one we're talking about tonight, Jet Age Hotels, is one of my absolute favorites.
So it's a beautiful book and really beautifully illustrated. I mean, it's very rare you get academic books which are so generous in their colour pictures, but it's absolutely essential to the topic, isn't it? You can't really you can't do credit to a Miro mural in a hotel lobby without putting some colour in it.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think that modern architecture, so much was beautifully photographed by professional photographers in black and white for the journals, and it's always a joy to flick through old copies of the Architectural Review and of the American architectural journals. But these were buildings that were meant to be seen in color. They were extremely colorful buildings, and the color palettes, especially on the interiors, were extremely carefully chosen. So it was important for me that this book should be a full colour job.
Yeah. So, Jet Age Hotels. Do you want to... Yeah. It does exactly what it says on the tin, does it not? Or does it do a bit more than that?
Well, I hope it does a little bit more. My intention was to give a snappy title, but also to produce a serious book that would be an alternative global history of the modern movement in architecture and design. And as you'll know, there come out quite a number of really fascinating and engrossing accounts of modernism in the Middle East and in Africa and in Southeast Asia and in various places. And having traveled around the world a bit in my years before I had a young family, and having stayed in a number of once splendid hotels built in the 50s and 60s in different places, I kind of thought that they were a building type that was sort of hiding in plain sight, in that many works have been written about different aspects of the modern movement of housing and public and civic buildings and buildings for the state, but that hotels were a really important building type about which very little had actually been written.
I like this idea of hiding in plain sight, and I think you're absolutely right. And it's quite weird. I was talking to when this book came through, and you sent me this book, and thank you for it, I showed it to my wife, and she said, "What about that one in Folkestone?" And I said,
The hotel burst in.
the worst hotel in Britain. That's the reputation it's got. But again, it's one of these buildings, and we had just been, and I'd seen it, and it hadn't registered. And yeah, there's this kind of whole culture around these enormous buildings that almost are like nodal points for modernity, aren't they? They're like the coordination points, literally the coordination points for the emergence of modernity as a global phenomenon.
I would say that's absolutely true. And I mean, in Britain, there's a very particular culture where quite often buildings of this sort were made in an extremely make do and mend, out and out laissez-faire commercial way. Mm-hmm. But the Burston Hotel in Folkestone absolutely exemplifies that. It was converted from an earlier building by having huge extensions added that dwarfed what was there before, and it really is a bit of a blot on the town there, one suggested. But around the world, between the ending of the Second World War and the mid-1950s, I think that elites in different developing countries had very similar ideas, and indeed had a lot in common with each other, that they wanted to communicate in a post-colonial or increasingly post-colonial situation, ideas of national progression and development, and that hotels were a very powerful way of doing that. Mm. And so one had, I think, fascinatingly, architects from all over the world who'd usually been trained in Europe, or possibly occasionally in the United States of America, but who'd been interested in European modernism, getting opportunities to design hotels. It must have been a dream project to design such a building, and trying to produce outcomes that would be representative of the ideal of the nation in a post-war situation. So this was as true in Latin America as it was in Iran or in countries in Africa. And with the advent of jet air travel, of course, the world shrank very, very quickly. And those who were wealthy and well-connected could enjoy a kind of globalized cosmopolitan culture like never before. Now, of course, because America was the great post-war power in the Western world, these hotels were highly Americanized quite often. And running a hotel is a very difficult thing. So sensibly, in most places, the developers of new hotels, which were usually national governments or organizations connected with national governments, called in existing hotel chains who had the management expertise to make them run the way they should, because that required skills in itself.
Mm. So this you mentioned this at the very beginning of the book. So you've just raised a number of really, really important themes. This idea of the kind of post-colonial moment, and the Jet Age title relates it obviously to that post-war and high modernist or international modernist movement, and you talk about that quite clearly, and sort of track the story from that post-war and emancipation moment, and this kind of hopefulness where these buildings are great pieces of architecture with unique characteristics. There's a kind of, it's international style, made local through local colour. Often you note the employment of architects associated with that country, and yet at the same time it's playing into this kind of new globalized narrative. But the jet point is really important, isn't it? It's this association between transportation and the international style.
I think that's absolutely true. And it's a new generation of transportation. There was an earlier geography of transport that dated from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which involved trains and ocean liners. And a lot of that was damaged or destroyed in the Second World War and in post-war conflicts. And of course, the jet age and the development of road travel, road transport, created a new geography. So whereas earlier generations of luxury hotel tended to be built in proximity to the major railway stations, the new hotels were built really where the major international jet airlines went to. And so there's a kind of tension between a desire for new hotels in countries that were moving forward or had aspirations to move forward around the world, and the desire of the American-dominated airline system, global airline system, to have hotels in destination cities that were attuned to the tastes of American guests. So sometimes one has situations where hotels are entirely developed by countries that have got aspirations to global status, like Brazil, for example, where a new hotel was created in the capital, Brasilia, almost before any other building was completed.
Yeah, the photograph.
But in many cases, one has countries giving the go-ahead for new hotels to be built, but then entering into agreements with the big American hotel chains, which were Hilton and Intercontinental. And Hilton had an agreement with Trans World Airlines. Hilton International and Trans World worked together. And Intercontinental was, of course, the hotel offshoot of Pan American.
So I mean, that's quite interesting. Again, this idea. I mean, I wonder if there is. I don't want to get into the kind of political economy of it, but I wonder if there is an element to these hotels of them operating almost like consulates of the American expansion, the post-imperial moment where America gathers in the declining Western world's colonies. And I mean, is there a sense that it's?
I think that's very much true up to a point. I would say that the relationship between hotels and the post-war architecture of diplomacy is a very important one. And I was actually, you took the words out of my mouth pretty much, Ambrose. If you consider buildings like the new United Nations in New York or the United Nations building in Paris, in many ways, their public circulation spaces are extremely similar to the post-war hotels. And instead of having multi-story accommodation for bureaucrats, if instead they had bedrooms, you'd have buildings that were almost identical based on originating modernist archetypes. So I think that the diplomatic link is very important. And another important aspect, which has been written about by others, namely Annabel Jane Wharton in the United States, is this issue of the Cold War and American cultural diplomacy. And so absolutely it's correct that Hilton and Intercontinental developed hotels as extensions to the American-dominated airline networks in places where they were worried that it might be likely that there could be some interest in aligning with the Soviet sphere of influence. So there's a very strong political and economic aspect to this subject. But of course, it's not the only aspect. There's as much as America was wanting to gain cultural and economic and political influence around the world, different countries around the world were wanting to be noticed in the new post-war setting. And I would say that
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that Annabel Jane Wharton in her research, excellent as it is, ignores is the strong will on the part of other countries to assert themselves through the design of hotels. Hilton, which operated many of the hotels that were actually built and financed by other countries, Conrad Hilton, that chain's owner, was very, very strongly anti-communist, and is a very interesting figure for a whole lot of reasons in terms of the politics of the immediate post-war era. But he hardly ever built a hotel for his own purposes. I think the Beverly Hilton in Beverly Hills was one of the very, very few. In almost every situation, Hilton either took over existing hotels or more likely entered into management contracts where he took over the operation of hotels that had been created by others.
So this is a really interesting. This is a really interesting and key point, isn't it? So Hilton and his ilk, they're using this, as you said, cultural diplomacy. It is even perhaps if it's not a kind of orchestrated from the political centre, it is a kind of cultural thing, which I think is and yet you've got, and he's anti-communist, and yet you've got countries that are going down a kind of socialistic route, also doing the same thing. So it becomes a kind of, the language of this hotel infrastructure almost becomes uniform, regardless of political positioning, and that's more to do, and I'm picking this up from your book, that's more to do with the fact that high modernism, international style hotels of the jet age are in a way an extension themselves of the jets themselves, that you get in, and you make this
absolutely true.
Yeah, you make this lovely point in chapter 1 about right at the beginning, that this idea of the jet age is about getting into these extraordinarily risky spaceship-like machines and flying at unbelievable speeds, unimaginable speeds, only a matter of decades before. And then to stick them in some kind of shabby Victorian, confused sub-rococo terracotta interior like Manchester's Midland Hotel, which is also, giant, would seem incongruous. So the international style is articulated as a mechanism of being progressive, looking progressive as a nation, looking progressive as a tourist board, looking progressive as an architect or a commissioner or whatever it is.
I think that's absolutely so. Yeah, there was a need for a new aesthetic to go with the jet age, and airport architecture exemplified it. Of course, a lot of the travelers were business travelers, my father no exception. And the office block was actually, part of the story too. The international style Americanized office block with its grand travertine-clad foyer with probably Ludwig Mies van der Rohe Barcelona chairs in a group and some kind of abstract painting on the wall. And in a way, a business hotel bedroom of the 50s and 60s was a little bit like a private office. The major difference being that in the office, the desk was in the center of the room, whereas in the hotel room, it was the bed, and the desk was pushed into a corner so that you could work there if you wanted. So I think that there is a important similarity with, the airports, offices, possibly even places like new hospitals and other kinds of, mass-produced modernist buildings where an archetype was created and then it was replicated in a variety of forms around the world.
The one that I struck me looking through your book, when this description of the kind of almost generic quality, the Statler Hilton in Dallas, as you say, it could have been, what was that hospital building in Glasgow? It was almost, the one just down south of the Kelvin Museum.
Yeah.
Almost
but
like
of a much better quality. I mean, I think that this is one of the other things that greatly attracts me to these buildings and having stayed in some in different places, is that they were of immense quality. And it's quite rare in Britain that one finds a building constructed in the 50s or early 60s that is of great quality. There are some, but they're the exceptions rather than the rules. For every Royal Festival Hall, there's a number of really banal and awful office blocks, for example, put up by Charles Clore and his ilk. And the London Hilton is a pretty grim example of the species of international style hotel, by Clore and for maximum profit at minimum investment.
That's Britain.
Hotels around the world in other countries and were often, usually, some of the costliest and most beautifully designed and opulently appointed examples of international modernism ever constructed. Very little expense was spared on materials and architectural servicing. And if one considers the Statler in Dallas, which has not so long ago been restored very nicely, Statler was an interesting phenomenon. It was a very early chain to apply Fordism, American Fordism, to the provision of hospitality, to build very, very big hotels where every single room was standardized and fitted with a private bathroom, and offering overnight accommodation at really quite low prices. So they were aimed at the business and tourism market. The Statler in Dallas was one of the few they built after the Second World War, before the chain was taken over by Hilton. And it was an extremely clever building designed by William Tabler, who was probably America's greatest post-war hotel architect. I mean, he built hundreds of hotels all over the USA, but he also built a fair few in different places around the world. And, for example, I was actually discussing this with somebody in a completely different context the other day in relation to the servicing of cruise ships. One of the very clever things about the design of the Statler Hilton in Dallas, as it was originally the Statler, it became the Statler Hilton after the takeover, was that the curtain wall facade actually had in its spandrels the pipework for the ventilation system. So it meant that the rooms were uncluttered by ducting. And the fact that the cooling air was moving through pipes in the facade also helped to cool the whole interior without having to blow air to the same extent. And it avoided having such a large centralized ventilation system unit on the roof by having the ventilation distributed across the facade. So you had fan rooms and the sort of servicing that made the air conditioning function distributed across the building, which also meant that if it broke down, it only broke down locally rather than for the whole place. And where there would have been normally a great big structure on the roof containing all of this stuff, there was instead a helipad, so you could get straight from the airport to the hotel. So in terms of just sort of fresh thinking about how you might plan and service a building, there's an incredible amount of ingenuity.
Yeah, but it is a very interesting building. It reminds me of Manchester Piccadilly, actually, in a certain extent, and it's got that kind of glamour to it as well. But the Beverly Hilton, it ain't, which has a just kind of, I mean, it's kind of a fabulous quality to it.
I mean, I visited it quite some years ago before its latest redeck, and I thought it was absolutely fascinating. The Beverly Hilton was, as I mentioned earlier, one of Conrad Hilton's very few personal projects that he actually financed and oversaw the designing of. And one of the great joys of doing this book was that I managed to get in contact with the architect who'd actually designed that hotel, Louis Nadorf, who was still alive and living in California. And I wrote to him and I thought, well, I don't know what will happen. I don't know if he's, able to answer. And I got the most fantastic 12-page handwritten response posted to me at the School of Art in Glasgow, in which he told the whole story about how the place was designed. And Conrad Hilton took a great personal interest in its design. I think that as I recall, the point of origination was the success of a hotel in Puerto Rico called the Caribe Hilton, which had been the first modernist hotel that Hilton had been involved in. And it was completed in 1949, designed by Puerto Rican architects. But it was right beside the Caribbean Sea. And it had bedrooms all with balconies, and it kind of showed a new way of designing a hotel. It had all the features of a modern post-war Caribbean resort hotel, almost the prototype of that genre. And Conrad Hilton wanted a similar hotel in Beverly Hills in order to entertain his friends in Hollywood. Hilton, before he was a hotelier, was a showman. He was a vaudevillian. And he was married in the late 40s, quite briefly, to Zsa Zsa Gabor. So he was very closely acquainted with the Hollywood scene. And he had this desire for a hotel that had the qualities of the Caribe Hilton, like a Caribbean resort hotel, in kind of suburban greater Los Angeles. And so young Louis Nadorf, who had not long designed the Capitol Records building in Hollywood, got to design this one, and he did a fantastic job. I mean, it's a very, very elegant building with a kind of a triangular plan, a little bit like the Mercedes logo when viewed from above, with 3 wings coming out from a central core. And that means that there's one area, one forecourt created for a grand entrance, and another area in one of the triangular spaces created by the wings for the swimming pool and the kind of poolside life. Even although it's in suburban Los Angeles, it's surrounded by studio lots and sprawling villas. It's not beside the Caribbean Sea. And then there's a third part where you can have all the behind the scenes stuff, the bins and the food storage and all of the things that you don't really want to be seen. So in terms of actually handling accommodation, public rooms, a grand entrance, outdoor fun and servicing, it's a brilliantly simple plan, beautifully realized, and I think it's a building that stood the test of time superbly well. It's still, I think, a very successful hotel nowadays, and in a fast-changing city like Los Angeles, that's no mean achievement.
That's true. So the commissioning of these hotels in it, certainly in its early iteration. So you talk later on about how again, in your conclusion, about how these hotel chains eventually got sold into British hands, which kind of put the kibosh on their many of their qualities, and the hotel chains have subsequently pursued shareholder value rather than architectural, spatial, or even visual aesthetic value. But Conrad Hilton, for one, by your description, seems to have been intimately involved in the actual conception of the architecture itself, and it's very much a kind of quality-driven vision rather than this. I suppose what I'm trying to understand is, because we've talked about this idea of cultural diplomacy, so this idea of the expansion of the American domination of culture across the world, which has been very, very strong, but at the same time, that's not Conrad Hilton's idea. What he wants to do is produce great buildings.
Well, I would say Conrad Hilton certainly had a lot of input in the interiors. Typically, local architects would create a shell And Hilton's people, when they got the contract to run the hotel, would then decide how the interior servicing should be arranged. And he wanted to make the hotel successful, and he realized that from his own experience as a hotelier in the USA, that different people wanted different things. So therefore, it was a good idea to have a big centralized kitchen, but to have 3 or 4 different catering outlets, ranging from extremely exclusive and formal and expensive to maybe one that was themed in relation to the locale, like in Athens, Greek taverna, for example, and perhaps then also one that was more like a kind of burger bar where you could get fast food of a decent quality, and that would appeal to a different section of the hotel's clientele. So he had very good ideas about how a successful hotel should operate commercially, but I don't think that he was much of an aesthete. He was a showman, and he liked thematic design and things that were attention-grabbing and had a certain kind of traditionalist elegance. But one of the surprising things in design, in writing this book, or researching and writing it, was that I kind of thought that it was that Hilton must have been an architectural connoisseur, or somebody who would have had some interest in modern architecture, because it seemed that he conspired to end up with many, many good buildings. But one of the things that I discovered was that was more by luck than by design. And it was simply that, from everything I can gather, he didn't really like modern architecture. He saw it as inevitable and necessary from a commercial point of view, but his own taste was more in the Baroque and the Rococo. And his own mansion in Beverly Hills was certainly in that idiom. But he seemed to think that he had a good idea of what the public would respond to. And what I suppose events showed was that it wasn't just an American public, because America is a pretty cosmopolitan country. It was a global public. So wherever Hilton signed up to take over the running of one of the hotels that had been built in, whether it be Istanbul or Cairo or in Hong Kong or wherever, it seemed that there was a global audience for the kind of solution that he thought would work well. This
also. So you mentioned this. This idea of the Fordist approach. Hilton, we don't want to focus too much solely on Hilton, but Hilton is obviously probably the major player in all of this. He actually, Anyway, I want to come back to this idea of this populism that's at the heart of his aesthetic, which I think is really interesting. So he's a Hollywood man, he's a vaudeville man, and he recognises common tastes and the emergence of common tastes or everyday values in as a mediating factor in the esoteric and high modernist stuff. I think that's really, really interesting, because you do then, and we mentioned this before we started recording this, Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi Learning from Las Vegas. The idea of the domination of modernist architecture in the end by common values is quite an interesting one, and he embodies that, doesn't he? And these hotels embody that, all of them, regardless. There's this idea of taking on the technologies, the structures, the transportation of modernity, and then turning them back towards populist.
Yeah, I would say all except very, very few. To start with the ones that don't, there's of course one of the buildings that absolutely inspired me to write the book, and a building that's one of my favorites in the world, the SAS Royal Copenhagen by Arne Jacobsen, which was run by a very famous Scandinavian airline, a very successful global airline. But they kind of eschewed the American commercial approach in that their hotel was with a entirely modernist design by a very famous architect, and it only had one restaurant, and it had very little by way of shopping or the other things that the more commercial operators put in. And then there was Oscar Niemeyer's Brasilia Palace in Brasilia, which I briefly mentioned earlier, which again was a national statement. Yeah. But they were quite unusual. You're absolutely correct that the broader tendency was towards a kind of quotidian populist solution with regard to the design of interiors. And I stopped my book in 1965. I thought the interesting thing would be to cover the period from the end of the Second World War until the mid-60s, and to just stop before the wide-body jets came along, before things like the Boeing 747 and the Lockheed TriStar made jet air travel mass pursuit. Which again, it's Fordism applied to the actual air travel part itself, that you build a big aeroplane that can take several hundred and you can lower the ticket price considerably. So the hotels I'm considering in the book were ones built mostly in the 50s and in the early 60s, where the passengers were coming in, particularly in the early 60s, in Boeing 707s and planes that were carrying just over 100 passengers. So they were initially quite exclusive buildings that became, as time progressed, increasingly populist. And one of the last buildings I discuss in the book is the New York Hilton, which was the first huge Hilton, which had, hundreds and hundreds of rooms. And it was a kind of predictor of the next generation of hotels that would be built for the wide-bodied jets. If one continues forward, in the early 70s, of course, when the oil crisis happened, the next generation of the Hilton family, after Conrad Hilton retired, realized that there was a lot of money to be made in the gaming business. So they moved into Las Vegas in a very big way. And Hilton did become heavily associated with gambling and with a much more popular clientele than it had been associated with in the 1950s. So, yeah, it's a gradual process, this move from relatively pure designs to ones that Venturi and Scott Brown and Isinor would very much recognize and approve of.
Yeah, I'm glad you mention Isinor, because he always gets forgotten. Poor old Stephen Isinor, the forgotten third. He probably did all the writing. I don't know. Bet he's the ghost, isn't he? But anyway, but this association again, not only of the hotel design with the futurism and the kind of progressive ideals of the emerging space age, but also of mass entertainment, which makes a lot of sense of the trajectory of the career of Hilton himself. That there's this kind of, I mean, I find in a literary kind of way, the possibility that Hilton is in a way a failed Hollywood star that wants to then sort of gather in his celebrity friends and starts making them hotel. I mean, there is a kind of tragic quality to this whole thing.
Things happened slightly differently for him. He could have been a major impresario. I mean, I think he was somebody who simply had a tremendous business sense.
It sounds like it.
he comes over as being a fascinatingly complex person, not an entirely likable person. He was full of contradictions. On the one hand, he was a Christian fundamentalist who introduced prayer breakfast in the White House during the 1950s, during the Eisenhower era. And so he's sort of very much associated with the kind of Christian revival in post-war America and bankrolled that significantly. He was a businessman. He was a playboy, famous for being on the arm of numerous glamorous women. But he was also a cosmopolitan and somebody who, so far as I can see, within the limitations of his own background, which was from a small village in New Mexico, and the era he lived in, he genuinely wanted people of all creeds and races and backgrounds to coexist and get along. So that's not to suggest that he perhaps aligned with our contemporary notions of what's good and proper in that regard, but he certainly had a positivist view of different peoples around the world.
And that maybe that goes some way towards
interesting figure.
Yeah, maybe that goes some way towards explaining this kind of way that local culture. Because, if you look at the kind of juggernaut of modernism, of high modernism, the Mies van der Rohe and the Le Corbusier thing, and I think about, when I think about Le Corbusier, I can't help but think about his proposal for Addis Ababa, which is a sort of erase it all and then put something uniform in its place, or even Robert Bruce's plan for Glasgow, or Abercrombie's various plans for around the UK, which is a programme of erasure, Robert Moses in New York. And instead what he does is he takes, or these jet age hotels in general, and Nehemiah you could see also doing this, although in a more subtle way in Brasilia. They take a motif, which is the modernist aesthetic, and they make it amenable to local interpretation. Without at any point there's no sense of patronizing. These emancipated countries want modernism because they want to be modern.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think three of the architects that I came across in researching this book, Haydar Guy, who was an Iranian architect who designed the Hilton in Tehran and a number of other very significant modernist buildings there. He very much mixed Persian and Iranian vernacular elements with international modernism. And he was somebody who was extremely well connected. He was French trained in the École des Beaux-Arts, and he knew Arne Jacobsen and Alvar Aalto and Frank Lloyd Wright, and pretty much all the important figures of the modern movement were acquaintances with whom he corresponded. And in Istanbul, in Turkey, another architect that I've come to hugely admire through this work was Sedat Eldem, who designed the beautiful Hilton in Istanbul alongside Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. In most books about Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, they're credited with the majority of the work on the building, but I'm pretty certain that a much greater amount of it was by Eldem, who was a great sophisticate. And if one looks at not only the design of the lower stories, for which he normally gets the bulk of the credit, if one looks at the design of the facades and the balconies, it's very much in an Ottoman Turkish idiom melded with international modernism. And the Puerto Rican architect Toro y Ferrer, who designed the Caribe Hilton, again, they were American trained, but they were, very influenced by the Bauhaus and by the avant-garde in Europe of the 1930s, and kind of made it Latin, made it Central American, made it Puerto Rican. Mm-hmm. And in all instances, they designed, I think, extremely beautiful buildings that melded the idea of cosmopolitanism through the international style with elements that were of their own countries. And produced outcomes of superb elegance. I mean, the Caribe Hilton, completed in 1949, owes a debt to some of Corbusier's pre-war proposals that were eventually realized in the Unité d'Habitation. But that hotel was built sometime before the first of the Unités d'Habitation were completed. So it was a really, in global terms, it was an extremely early example of a large accommodation block on pilotis. And because it was in a tropical Caribbean climate, it was able to realize the qualities of open space probably a lot better than any European architect succeeded in doing.
Yeah, and also make sense of sort of, because what I've noticed looking through is looking through the book is the way that articulated facades, particularly, and you've mentioned it with the ventilation system built into the ventilation ducting built into the front of the into the front of the which one is it again? I'm terrible.
The Dallas.
Yeah, the Dallas one. But this idea of taking modernism and making it climatically relevant. I mean, the beautiful Intercontinental in Karachi, which is a fantastic idea. And I was talking, I did a recording of this with Alan Powers, and he was talking about this idea of other moderns, or modernisms that have sort of fruited in other parts of the world, but are generally speaking not discussed within as canonical forms of modernism, because we have this very rarefied kind of 10 architects that we're allowed to talk about when we talk about the greats of modernism, Louis Kahn and Asplund and Alto and Corbin and so on. But there's this lovely thing of this of a second modernism which is just as potent, that emerges particularly in the global south or in the post-colonial context and third, which I just think is worthy of even more.
Absolutely. I'm very much looking forward to the 20th Century Society's work on British modern architects working in the Commonwealth, which I believe is on the way.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of that work has qualities.
I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, I
think one of the problems is that. I think one of the problems, of course, is access to the media. And London and New York and Los Angeles are kind of centers of where architectural publishing happens. And also, very sadly, because of subsequent politics, Hidar Guy's entire archive was destroyed in the Iranian Revolution. And his son now, who assisted me with the research for the book, Eve, works in California, and he knows by word of mouth a bit about his father's work. But trying to piece together the material is almost as much a challenge for him as it is for me, simply because it was all destroyed. His office was ransacked in 1979, and every item was burnt and strewn. So it's all just dissipated. So one has this extremely important, clearly superbly talented Iranian architect for whom no archive exists.
My word. How sad. How sad. I like this idea. I would like to think about these hotels, I suppose, in a little way, in this idea of the Guy Debord's idea of the urban spectacle. Because I think that some of these, but I mean, looking at, for example, Nehemiah's hotel in Brasilia, where, as you pointed out, it gets built before anything else, and that photograph you've got of just, it's almost like New York when Manhattan is being built in the late 19th and early 20th century, and you've got the kind of grid set out, but none of the buildings are there yet. It's almost got that quality to it. There's a picture on page 126. This thing has landed like a spaceship, and it's quite clearly doing that. It's quite clearly doing the urban spectacle. It's quite, particularly that building, which is just a phenomenal piece of design, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think that I'm guilty as charged. I think that these buildings exemplify the idea of the urban spectacle superbly well. I guess that spectacular buildings at important locations have been made since ancient times. So Debord tends to associate them with contemporary, capitalism, but I think it's a long history, and that in commissioning Niemeyer, the Brazilian government clearly were wanting to make a major statement in Brasilia, and they thought that people would come from around the world to see the city under construction. And so the hotel was required from an early stage. I'm bound to say that the Brasilia Palace is as fascinating for its failures as for its successes. From what I can gather, from the outset, it was rather a badly run hotel with dreadful food, and nothing quite worked. It was perhaps a little bit more like the modernist hotel as depicted by Jacques Tati than the ideal. And of course, its design was completely crazy. It was created for aesthetic reasons rather than practical ones, in that it had an enormously long horizontal accommodation block of only about 4 stories with endless corridors. And so in terms of dealing with fire safety, getting fire escape routes, and even sensible circulation, it was not how you should design a hotel. Yeah. Niemeyer was asked to produce a beautiful, striking object rather than something that actually would work well. Yeah. And of course, it was completed in the late 50s. And in the mid-70s, it was swept from end to end by fire. And then it spent as long as a wreck as it had ever operated, until in the early 21st century, Niemeyer's office was called in again to restore it. Yeah. And kind of version number 2 corrected the errors of the original. So it's a building that's had a turbulent and sad history that in some ways reflects that of Brazil itself, from the social democracy of the 50s under Julishenko through the years of dictatorship when it fell into decline and burnt out, and then in more recent time being beautifully and elegantly revived in a new and improved form.
But so these hotels fundamentally then are early examples of what we now call the Bilbao effect, the Guggenheim, where you get your Starchitect. But in this case, it wasn't necessarily Starchitects. I mean, you have a chapter on Chapter 5, International Style Hotels by Architects with High Cultural Profiles, but most of the book is not dedicated to these kinds of buildings. Most of it is not anonymous, but perhaps, second string modernist work or first string modernist work by underknown architects. But these buildings are fundamentally about creating a series of nexus points for this, I don't know, what is it? Organization of capitalist space. It's all based on oil. It's all based on the age of oil and the Anthropocene and it's the carve up of the world, and these are kind of your nodal points. This is where you go for your pina colada and your you come in with a nice girl on your arm, and then go off and strike your deals for American oil before flying off in your DC-10.
That's probably to a very large extent correct. Yeah, absolutely. Not 100% though. Quite a lot of hotels were built where there was no oil, but to an extent that is true. They're very much reflective of the concerns of a particular era, and it was an era where oil was the great driver of everything. It was what made the aeroplanes fly, and it was what drove. Yeah, absolutely. It's what drove global finance. Yeah. I'm actually this very coming week going to be at a conference in Copenhagen, the World Maritime Technology Conference, where the main subject is post-carbon power for ships. So it's got nothing to do with hotels, but it could be an important moment in the shifting tectonic plates of how things are powered and how change happens. But I think the significant thing about oil in the 50s was that the downside wasn't seen the way it's seen today. And that these hotels were, part of that infrastructure that was very much, powered by jet engines and motors, and oil was underpinning a very great deal of it. And it was all seen to be a good thing. I mean, oil, of course, is a lot cleaner than coal smoke.
Yeah.
if that's but a weak excuse.
Well, I mean, it's not a weak excuse, and I think it's, without getting too much into all of that nonsense, it's worth keeping in mind how emancipating the discovery and use of crude oil has been for the world's poor. It's been like nothing on earth. So I'll die on that hill. I'll die arguing that. So I'm
brave man.
Well, I mean, if you look at it, Bruce,
right.
even discussions around sustainability are fundamentally arguments about oil, but in its inverse, because we have constructed cultures that are entirely dependent upon massive quantities of energy, and other than nuclear, we haven't got an answer yet. So anyway, we can leave that aside. That's me just being a bit controversial there. But the other, I did want to kind of, I've kind of forced you into a corner a little bit in terms of talking about a more political economy approach to these things. But the aesthetics of these things, particularly the interiors, are things of great beauty, with a beautiful quality of finish. And I just I wondered whether you could speak a little on that, because I think your writing is very elegant. It's a beautifully written book, and it's incredibly clear that you have a love for this.
Absolutely. I think that on the energy issue, I think hindsight is a wonderful thing. And I suppose that's also the case with regard to cultural politics more generally, race and gender relations, and all the sort of quite right concerns that we have nowadays. And I guess as a historian, one has to find a balance between the contemporary view of the past and the past as it was experienced and understood by the people who were the movers and shakers and the clientels back at that time. Yeah. So it's something that I struggle with every time I put hand to keyboard, really. On the subject of aesthetics, which is probably one I feel at this particular moment more inclined to speak about at excruciating length. I think it's absolutely right that these hotels had a lot of love expended upon them. That ignoring the wishes of the operators to an extent, and the money men who had to make the projects commercially viable. Those who actually commissioned the hotels, those working in government and government-related organizations around the world, really wanted to make spectacular, memorable, and sophisticated style statements. A lot of money was spent on materials, high quality finishes in marble and granite, and materials that were made to stand the test of time. Often also local types of stone, in order, so it wasn't just a question of pouring concrete and sticking a lick of paint on it. Within, furniture was often bespoke. The artworks on the walls were usually by important local modern artists, and it involved sculpture, tapestries. I mean, some of the buildings were essentially art galleries, as well as being offering luxury accommodation. And the details of the food service and the drinks provided and all of these things were very, very carefully thought through, and required often major international supply chains in order to get, especially for the drinks, to get all the right bottles lined up behind the bars. And what I've also tried to talk about to an extent in the book is the human side. I've developed through this work a number of very good friends who are senior people in the hotel business, who were there and were at the front line managing hotels in places ranging from Istanbul to Melbourne. And they're very special people with incredible skills and talent. I think to be a hotel manager or a chef in charge of a large commercial kitchen, these are things that require tremendous expertise. And just as we have our heroes in architecture, these people have their heroes too. People like Briat Savarin and Cesar Ritz, and they would look back to the great hoteliers and chefs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries who ran the first generations of luxury hotels. And so there's a sort of great tradition of grand hospitality. And it's also got, particular interesting national emphases that, for example, the French and the Swiss, of course, are very well known for their hotel skills, and French and Swiss managers have been desired by hotels of all nations around the world. And so that whole side of hotel management and hotel operation, and of course one of the reasons why Hilton was successful was because they knew to get the right people. Intercontinental too. They were rarely American. Sometimes they were, but very often it was European managers and chefs. And so because I think that has been one of my arguments in my writing about modern architecture and design, has been that wherever the modern movement has been successful, it's been in relation to people being fed and watered and entertained. So you think about the Stockholm exhibition, for example, in 1930, which was a beautiful event from what we can gather from the pictures. But what was very important was the fact that it was full of cafes and restaurants, and there were bandstands, and that you went in and had a fabulous time. So you became much more open to the avant-garde aesthetics because you were having a nice cake or a cocktail or something like that. And I think that the hotels were very successful for similar reasons, that you would be sitting in a restaurant in Istanbul, staring out across the Bosphorus through floor-to-ceiling plate glass windows, seated in modernist furniture, eating off modernist flatware, possibly with some kind of Turkish traditional design worked into it as well, eating something absolutely fabulously cooked from the kitchen, and feeling $1 million. And I think that combination, while potentially puffing occasionally on a cigar, but the smoke isn't a problem because it's all air conditioned. So I think it's actually that kind of multifaceted experience of the modern that includes architecture, interior design, taking in furniture, tableware, lighting, canned music coming through loudspeakers, the food, the service, all of these things all hang together to create a particular experience and a particular state of mind. And I think that when it's done well, it's a tremendous, memorable achievement.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. I mean, I just listening to you there and thinking about the buildings that you illustrate in your writing and in the photographs, there's an architecture. I've thought for a while that there's a book to be written. I've only got a title, but it's just called Architecture in the Age of Abundance. And the 20th century, that post-war period, was an era of abundance. And it wasn't just abundance in stuff, although we got good at getting that out of the ground, but in sort of hope and in joy. And there in these hotels, that's embodied in this design. There's this kind of lavish concern for design, which is really well illustrated in the book. That, as you say, is very humane, and I think, and progressive, and all of these things. It's progressive in one direction or another, but there's this idea that another world was possible in that sweeping away of the horrors of the first half of the 20th century. And these buildings that you describe, and the SAS in Arne Jacobsen's SAS is a really good example of that. It's extremely civic. They're outward-looking and civic, and the hotels that we go now, and my wife's Californian, so I've been to quite a few of those casino hotels run on reservations they are the opposite of civic. You go in to escape the civic, and you look inwards. You look at a craps table, or you look at a blackjack table, and then there's no windows, and it's kind of, and these buildings are very, they're very hopeful. They're an architecture of an age of hope, and perhaps that's the thing we should take from that, is that looking at these buildings, we are seeing back to a time of where design is utilized to communicate and enhance and advance a story about human potentiality, which is not a bad story, let's be honest.
My dear fellow, if you ever want to write that book, I'd be happy to collaborate with you. we could take on Barnabas and his history of architecture based on energy.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if we haven't got hope, what have we got, Bruce?
It's a very interesting concept, and I have to say that whenever it's possible, I love checking into the SAS Royal. I think, sadly, a few years ago, it had a rather unsympathetic renovation, which has somewhat spoilt it. But in my opinion, it was done by Space Copenhagen, who were the ones who made the Noma restaurant for René Redzepi, the chef. And I think that they were possibly not the most subtle people to employ for this particular job. But beforehand, you'd go in and sit in either the Café Royal having a dinner, or up in the top floor in the restaurant called Alberto K, which was made in the former flat of the original manager. And it actually, after half a century, it still had that wonderful feeling of being in a better world. Even in Copenhagen, which is one of the most beautiful and charming and elegant of cities. You go into this hotel and just the huge expanse of Greenland marble flooring and the black leather egg chairs nicely spaced in groups and the palisandre wall paneling all softly lit round the edge and the spiral staircase up. And you just even before you went to the check-in counter, you kind of felt you'd upgraded some. And I think that lots of people have got discussions about what design is for. Perhaps I'm maybe a little bit shallow in simply wanting luxury and good food. But I think that actually it's quite a nice thing to be able to experience and to achieve. And I think these buildings were not perfect. They were subjects of politics and economy and of human frailty and greed and avarice and all the usual, but they had a certain something, and they're pieces of architecture that I certainly think are worth considering for their shortcomings as well as their qualities.
Well, that's a lovely point to finish on. So I'm going to finish it there. Thank you so very much, Bruce.
Thanks ever so much, Ambrose. I greatly appreciate it, and it's lovely to see you.
Well, that was a charm. Thanks to Bruce for his fine company. Please see the podcast description for links to the book and for Bruce's professional and social links. And don't forget to like, subscribe, follow and share A is for Architecture with literally anybody. Cheers.